welcome everyone to this Alliance Breakfast Club, which we're hosting with the Gartum Institute, and thank you to the Gartum Institute for this beautiful venue, and delighted to have Chloe also on the panel, we'll introduce properly later, and to Geneva Global, who've also been working with us on this. Just before I start, can I just say, we're not mic'd, we're live streamed, so this will be going out live. I hope nobody's unhappy with that. But we haven't got mics into the room, so if anybody can't hear anybody, please wave your hand and let us know. So just to say a few words about Geneva Global, our other partner in this. Geneva Global is an international consulting company, and they work with wealthy individuals and corporations in 110 countries to date, just to enable them to have the largest social impact possible. They offer a range of services, strategic advice, research, program and grant management, but all with, and help with impact measurement, but all with the aim of increasing their impact. And they were founded in 1999 by billionaire investment managers who didn't feel there was the right sort of advice available, so they set up their own organisation. So thank you also to Geneva Global for working with us on this. And thank you to everybody for coming at this rather early time. I hope you didn't have too difficult a journey given the lack of buses. Great to see you all here. For those of you who don't know me, my name's Caroline Hartnell. I'm editor of Alliance magazine, and you should have copies on your chairs. Alliance focuses on philanthropy and social investment worldwide. And I'd particularly like to draw your attention to the photos in this issue, which they're by Magnum War photographer Moises Saman, and he allowed us to use the photographs for free throughout the special feature. So they really are worth looking at. The topic of the December issue of Alliance, which will be the focus of this breakfast club, is philanthropy and transitions. Specifically, the special feature looks at the role foundations and philanthropy can play in post-conflict and post-authoritarian transitions. We looked at why these unique moments in history require a different level of creativity, flexibility, and willingness to take risk, which is something that's often talked about in the context of foundations, but perhaps more talked about than delivered. So we looked at what are the biggest challenges, the lessons learned, and so on. We were lucky to have a very special team of guest editors with huge expertise in this area, and happily one of them, Barbara Ibrahim, is here with us today. So I'm going to start by introducing our panel and start with Barbara. So Barbara, to my far right, is director of the Gerhardt Centre for Philanthropy.
Not politically, but geographically.
I don't know if we could carry on. Director of the Gerhardt Centre for Philanthropy and Civic Engagement at the American University in Cairo. And she was one of the guest editors for this special feature. And together with Mark Freeman, another of the guest editors, who is Executive Director of the Institute for Integrated Transitions in Barcelona, who sadly can't be with us today, Barbara wrote Supporting Countries in Transition, a Framework Guide to Foundation Engagement, which was, I think, the starting point perhaps for a lot of what we've got in the special feature. Then next to Barbara is Chloe de Preneuf, who's Programme Coordinator for the Transitions Forum at the Gartum. We're delighted to have her on our panel to bring a perspective from outside the philanthropy world, which I think we all badly need. Then to my immediate left is Walter Veers, who's Regional Director for Central Eastern Europe and Russia of the Charles Stewart Mott Foundation. And then to my far left is Joe Andrews, who's Director of Ariadne, which is the European Founders for Social Change and Human Rights Network. And Joe is also a contributor to the special feature. So this isn't meant to be all about the panellists. So just to say to all of you, the idea is that this should be really a conversation. So we want you to all chip in, not just ask questions, but, you know, give us your own experiences and points of view. But I'm going to start by asking Barbara to say a few words to introduce the special feature and what we aim to do and what we looked at and what we found. Barbara.
Thank you, Caroline. It's wonderful to be with you all this morning. We're coming on exactly 4 years since the Egyptian uprising that followed on the exuberance of a Tunisian popular uprising, and then all of the subsequent events. And when I think back to that moment 4 years ago in Cairo, where I've been living for many years, in the midst of a lot of euphoria, young people meeting to talk about how they could now participate in the future of their country, teams of citizens cleaning up the streets in all the neighborhoods of all the urban places. We began to see what started as a trickle, but soon became an avalanche of foreign visitors. Most of them with all the goodwill in the world, wanting to understand what was happening during this Arab Spring moment. How could they participate, either as foundations, individual donors, or somehow international organizations with a real genuine concern to support democratic transition in this part of the world. That moment is not so different than any transition country or region has experienced. The influx of interest and international focus on a transitioning country early on. But what followed in places like Egypt, Tunisia, Yemen, and elsewhere was very different than if we compare it to the moment during the Eastern European and former Soviet republics transition. Because that initial interest and concern and fact-finding was not followed by very much investment of time or resources or assets in the transitions of the Arab Spring. And it was in an attempt to understand the answer to that question of why, what has happened in the world, what is unique perhaps about the transitions that are taking place in the Arab region now. And to realize that a few months after that January, February moment in Egypt, Ariadne and Jo Andrews and her colleagues at the International Funders Group on Human Rights did a very smart thing. Instead of having every organization send someone to ask the same questions and cover the same territory, they organized a listening and learning trip to Tunisia. And I was there with Mark Freeman, who has one of the first and only institutes to study and understand transitions around the world. We came together as resource people. It was a wonderful visit. It had been tremendously well planned so that people could hear from civil society leaders, could discuss among themselves what were opportunities for international engagement. But we realized that the collective wisdom about private investing in transitions has never been collected, had never been reviewed, and therefore there was very little material that folks like yourselves who have an interest could rely upon and build upon to have smarter and more effective philanthropic investments. So Mark and I sat out on a year-long project to review what was known about transitions, what had worked, what had failed, and to produce the guidebook that Caroline was mentioning, which is now available on both of our websites, and tried to distill from the real veterans of these transitions, some of the names of whom you would recognize and some of whom were interviewed in this special issue. And the question that we continued then to grapple with was, are there elements of a successful transition that we can now point to and say, if a country, all other things being equal, are able to achieve this and this, their likelihood of getting to a successful endpoint will be far higher than had it not taken place. So one of the questions that we were asking in this issue of Alliance magazine, again, of a whole array of very diverse actors who are engaged intimately in this process, is what are the elements of success? What have you learned from your failures? And what can we share then and sort of shorten the learning curve for others who want to get involved? I will just quickly touch on some of these main points, and then we can come back to others in the discussion. One of the things that's very different about 21st century transitions is that they began to happen right at the tail end of a global recession. So one of the elements within the field that was different was that foundations were not feeling as flush financially. They didn't have as much risk capital that they were willing to put into a region or a country that obviously was not a sure bet. So added to the, what I would say is inherent conservatism of many of our traditional foundations across the world was this financial element. A second one had to do with identity politics and how difficult it was to really understand who the partners would be in countries that had very strong social movements that seemed to be rejecting Western intervention. And that's not only coming from the Islamists in the Arab world. You see it on the part of uber-nationalist, pro-military groups in some case, a rejection of Western intervention. I think if we think about the Eastern European transitions, it's obvious that the rest of Europe had an easier time identifying with that struggle. Eastern European and former Soviet republics had a model right next door of the kind of societies that they were aiming for, and it was Western Europe. It's much harder to understand what the desired end point is in many of these Arab countries, and there certainly is not a lot of consensus about it. So all of these things made it a much more difficult moment to have a clear board decision to invest funds, allocate staff, and begin to invest in transitions. Added to that, I would say we're at a moment in the philanthropy field, which I feel is potentially a very troubling and dangerous one, where the emphasis on metrics and measuring concrete success has begun to dominate. And if there was ever a messy process in which measurement is difficult, it would be national transitions. The whole deck of cards has been thrown up in the air, and outcomes are not predictable. If anyone had told me what Egypt was going to experience in the subsequent 4 years, I would have told them they were crazy. It would not be possible to oust an Islamist government in 1 year. It would not be possible for Egyptians to welcome back the military regimes that had underpinned leadership for 60 years. But in fact, these things happen. So if your field or your board or your decision-making process is driven by measurable outcomes, you may have a very difficult time understanding the nature of the work that you need to do, finding the actors who are unknown and untested and probably don't have a track record, but are going to become the next leaders, the generation that really are going to make the change in these countries. A theme that organized our issue and that we feel very strongly about as a conclusion for all of this is that if there's one element that predicts success or failure, it would be whether within that country an inclusive social and political pact is reached in which no group is excluded. It doesn't mean it's going to be easy once that is reached, and in fact it becomes harder when your lifelong enemies are at the table and are contesting for elections and for power. But until that is achieved, and if you still have a winner-take-all mentality, you've got a lot of work that will have to simply be postponed and done perhaps a decade later, perhaps 20 years later. So that is one of our major conclusions. The other is that 4 years is far too soon to judge failure. We hear a lot about the failed Arab Spring, and even within Egypt, a lot of young people are extremely discouraged about what's happened. But it takes a decade. It takes a decade to begin to know whether the trajectory is toward democratic and inclusive processes or not. I think I need to stop there, and we can come back and talk about any of these points later.
I mean, just one I'd like to add, which it just sort of, not to undermine you at all, but one of the lessons that was clear from the special feature also is that it's very hard to replicate lessons.
Absolutely.
You know, so that although
Absolutely.
you know this is really valuable work. I mean, one of our first articles was called lessons from lessons learned. And the first lesson learned was how difficult it is from Tom Carruthers, who some of you may have read his work in this sort of area. So that just is behind everything, that context. Perhaps the other one for me that came out was just how important the specific context is and the detail. Anyway, so having said that, Chloe, from outside, from your perspective, you know, including philanthropy and civil society, but outside it, do you want to just talk a bit about what you see as the biggest needs in countries in transition?
Well, it's a big question. So the biggest needs for countries in transition.
Just big.
But
just big.
Actually, just bouncing off this idea of you know, what are the lessons learned from lessons learned? It's very true that that the Eastern European or Central European model cannot be simply duplicated in the Arab world. And I think we all saw that. But you know, at least I think if we could at least stop repeating the same mistakes, that would be a huge improvement. We have a report. It's not exactly a transition country, but we have a report on Haiti, which just shows how difficult, even though there had been, even before the earthquake, huge lessons learned exercises and big pledges to build back better after the earthquake, and yet the same mistakes were made over and over again. So it's extremely difficult. But so the biggest needs, I think, well, the first one is obviously to tailor the response to the country. And to actually listen to the needs on the ground and to not repeat the same mistakes, which may seem obvious, but de-Baathification in Iraq was seen as one of the most obvious mistakes that were made in Iraq. And yet in Libya, pretty much the same thing happened. They passed a political isolation law, even though the Libyans were aware of how bad that had, how much of a failure that had been in Iraq. So it's much more difficult than it seems. I think the second element is time. So there's both time that we don't have. So a lot of these revolutions in the Arab world were very sudden. So the elites on the ground were not prepared, the opposition on the ground was not prepared to take over, to enact quick reforms after the revolution. And similarly, the donor community and the international community was not prepared and did not necessarily have the right contacts or came in with programs that had worked in other places but were not adapted to the country. But there's also the time that we do have. So there's both this need to have very quick impact because there's a very short window of opportunity where important reforms can happen and where where the population is willing to give the government...
There's some seats at the front as well.
Or the population is willing to give the government a bit of slack and willing to endure economic hardships, security hardships. But after when that's over, then it's over. So you have to act quickly to enact projects that have a quick, visible impact to gain the goodwill of the population. At the same time, and you mentioned this, transitions take a very long time. And there will be setbacks, and there will be huge disappointments. So there's also this realization that things will take time, and that the first setback is not necessarily the end. And that is also so both on the side of the reformers or the civil society activists who need to realize that, but also on the side of the donors or foreigners who will have to accept quite a lot of failure probably at the start. And then finally, and this is maybe the most obvious, but the most important part of it all is just the people. So the biggest need is both at the society level. So the fabric of society will have been, if not frayed, at least exposed. So the divisions that had either been co-opted under an authoritarian regime or that arose after the revolution, so the winners and the losers of the revolution, class, sectarian, all different types of divisions will be much more apparent. And there's what you mentioned actually, this need for dialogue essentially, and having a political inclusive pact. And usually this idea of inclusivity, pluralism, is not a natural one. If there is, you can imagine under an authoritarian regime, that there's no tradition of a real opposition that has the right to exist. And so that is a big change. So any big need is dialogue, national reconciliation. And then at the more individual level, just capacity building. So capacity building for civil society, which is usually going to be quite overstretched, not necessarily be able to even integrate all the resources that are pouring into the country all at once. They also need to be built up so that so that they're ready for the next revolution, if you're taking a pessimistic look at it. But the institutions of the state also are going to be extremely weak, and they need help and reforms, and that's usually more difficult because it's seen as political work, potentially, but that's also very important. Private sector, so a lot of these revolutions, especially in the Arab world, were about unemployment, were about dignity, and so social entrepreneurship, mentorship, all of these things will be extremely important, not just for employment levels, but also for human dignity, so to create these projects. And finally, very, very important is the media. Having a strong, independent, professional media, which will act as a watchdog, which people can rely on, which will also educate people. Because if we're looking right now at just the very small period of transition, but for all these changes, I think the biggest need is education reform, and that takes time. But one way to spearhead that and to reach people is the media. So, media is a big need.
Okay, thank you, Chloe, for that very wide-reaching sort of look at the needs. So, if we can carry on sort of coming down in focus, I want to ask Joe, having heard about your trip to Tunisia, which I should have known about, but anyway, it didn't. So maybe could I ask you about what role can philanthropy play in meeting these needs?
I think that philanthropy can play a role, but that it's really important that philanthropists are incredibly honest about that. I used to be a journalist, and I think journalists are transition junkies. They simply move from one transition to the other, and when it ceases to be a story, they drop it and depart for the next, more interesting transition. And I think that funders need to be in this for the long term if they're going to pick up a transition. And these things do take a long time. Chu En-lai in the 1970s was asked whether or not he thought the French Revolution had been a success, and his reply was, "It's too early to tell." And in some senses, in some of these countries, those are the timeframes on which we're operating. But I think the really useful thing that Barbara and Mark have done is to identify this special magic moment of when a transition starts. And there is this sort of golden opportunity, which if philanthropy can move reasonably fast and reasonably surely, then there is a real role for it, which is separate from what the UN can do, what some of the big agencies can do, and what some of the big governments can do. And I think the skill in this is for private philanthropy to actually identify, A, when that moment happens, and I think Barbara and Mark have done us all a fantastic favour in actually identifying that. I didn't know when I was a journalist that I was witnessing transitions. We used to call them crises or wars. But that is a very, very helpful frame for us. And that the idea that this is a moment when things can happen that cannot happen at other times. And it's like suddenly you get the opening of doors. So for 25 years, I used to get on a morning flight from London to Belfast, and it was the same old, same old. And then suddenly, it was all over. And there was a Good Friday agreement, and the whole thing had come to an end. And I never thought I'd see the end to that in my lifetime. I never thought I'd see the Berlin Wall come down. And yet, it came down almost overnight. And those are the times at which you need to move, because you can really take advantage of them. But the idea that Barbara and Mark have of setting up a special transitions fund so that you have money available in a pot at a foundation so that it is available for these occasions. And you're not scrambling around saying, oh my God, we've got to do something about Tunisia or Egypt or Northern Ireland or Haiti. And we're going to have to take the money from other pots, or somebody else is going to have to see their grant cut. You've got the money there. It's risk money. Go out and use it. And I would suggest to Barbara one of the reasons that so little money followed the initial promise and the trips and the four-wheel drive white Land Rovers that we all have seen people travelling around endless transitions in, is that people became nervous of the risk involved, or it was difficult for them to find the money, or by the time they had found out what it is that they wanted to do and identified their niche, another transition had appeared on the horizon which seemed more urgent to them. And I think if you can set aside some money and say, we don't know what this is for, but we know it will be needed, it's for transition, it's for taking opportunities, that's an incredibly helpful thought. The other thing I would say is the piece of judgment that's needed is the willingness to admit that on occasions there is nothing that private philanthropy can do. And this is a really hard one. I have worked at a foundation where on one occasion one of the board members came in and said, what's happening in Brazil is really important. We have to fund, we have to help. We had no program in Brazil. We had no experience of funding in Brazil. And yet he had identified that as a moment of transition. In Brazil, I thought there was something that we could do, and we did fund. But equally, there are times when you simply can't do anything. I mean, building civil society inside Syria at the moment, I don't think so. Funding some other crises where the thing is stuck and we're actually waiting for a political movement which is way over and beyond what private philanthropy can help engineer, then those are the moments at which to say, in great honesty, yes, we'd like to help, but now is not the moment for us.
Thank you, Jo. Barbara, do you want to add anything to that before I ask Walter about?
I want to push back
to
Jo a little bit.
First of all, an incredible amount is happening in civil society in Syria, and we simply don't hear about it because it's not headline grabbing. But work with children and women's programs and support to refugees and helping kids get education around the edges of all of the violence is incredibly important. And there are ways to channel funding in. And the second thing I would say is that, yes, I mean, foundations can do harm if they do things poorly, and we've seen enough of that, certainly in the Arab Spring moment. But there's a strategy that I think would work for any and all of us, and that is to understand what's happening in local philanthropy and to support the infrastructure and the strengthening of local private sources of funding. And I think that is a fairly fail-safe way to invest in almost any situation where you can find that kind of local philanthropic base.
Okay. Thank you, Barbara. That makes a perfect lead-in for asking Walter about, so the Mott Foundation has worked extensively in Central and Eastern Europe and then pushing further east, following transitions there. So Walter, how has Mott worked in these countries? I mean, do you think you've taken more risks, in quote marks? And what about strengthening local philanthropy? Is that should that be part of the mix?
Thank you. Thanks, Barbara, and thanks, Caroline. I'll come to that, but I'm sitting here thinking about the time aspect of it. In some ways, I suppose we're either here on this panel as the poster child for what happened for those who stay for long periods of time, because we started working in Central Europe in the early 90s. And it's either a good scenario or we're the poster child for what happens when you enter into a transition and you get so deeply into it that you simply don't know how to get yourself out of it.
Stuck.
I think it's the former, or I hope it's the former. We've been in Central Europe, as I said, since the early 90s. When we entered, we certainly entered very much with the transition paradigm. It was the moment of the early 90s, which we're all familiar with, that drew us there and sustained us, I think, in those first 5-10 years. And I remember very well, we had a colleague, a Hungarian colleague, program officer, and within the foundation, whenever we would write materials for our board or grant recommendations for our managers, we would quite often begin, the fall of the Berlin Wall in 1989 precipitated da-da-da-da. And at some point he said to us, probably 5 or 10 years after that period, he said, look, for me as a Hungarian, that is no longer the touchstone of, or the defining moment. There have been, moments since then that are better definitions of what we're going through and what we're talking about. In a way, we as the Mott Foundation need to update ourselves and acknowledge that moment has passed and that other moments have come to help us define what we do. And partly we were doing that because that was what kept our board engaged. And I think for many of us, there's this discrepancy between what the program officers on the ground see and what our boards back in wherever might see and understand and what motivates them. What motivates program staff is this sort of continual change in the progress towards something that you see every day on the ground and through the organizations that you work with. I think what sticks in a board's mind is that moment of transition. So we struggle even today to talk with our board about why we're still there, why we still need to be there, which of course we think we desperately do, and how to frame our engagement beyond this transition. But it's quite obvious too, and this is talked about a lot in the magazine and in Barbara and Mark's report, that transitions have a moment often of beginning, but they certainly don't have a moment where it all ends, and you can say, okay, our work is done, and we can go. I mean, many funders in Central Europe looked at the accession of the Visegrad countries and some of the other countries there as a moment when they could say, okay, our work is done and we've achieved something and we can move on. And I think that's a fair point, but at the same time, depending on what your issues were, nothing really dramatically changed on that day that those countries joined. If your issues are community development or rule of law, everything did not just magically change. There was an ongoing process and perhaps a new phase of the transition that began around that period. And the other point about time is that for us, in the way that we engaged, and many other funders engaged in Central Europe, was, of course, very much through the nonprofit sector, which was, in its, either didn't exist or was very rudimentary in the early 90s. And so a lot of work went into, or had to go into, building the nonprofit sector. And I tend to think of sort of the first 10 years of that period as strengthening the institutions of civil society, and then the second 10 years, period we're in now, as a time when you can actually have partners that you can accomplish things that you envisioned accomplishing in the first 10 years, but you simply found that your partners were not quite there yet, and you needed to help them get to the point where they had institutions that they could rely on, they had systems in their organizations, they were connected internationally and globally, they had the skills and so on. And at that point, at this phase, we really see things happening in the areas that we're working in. In terms of risk, I think the risks that we took, and the ones that, in a way, I'm proudest of, and I think were the smartest risks, were, especially in those first 10 years and the first 5 years, we're finding individuals who had very good ideas, who were enthusiastic, who you knew you could rely on to give it 150% of their effort to do what needed to be done, and making investments in those people. And at that time, it was very much about investments in people. It wasn't about investments in well-established organizations that could deliver, 30 roundtables or 15 publications or whatever your output wanted to be. They needed to do the work to begin to build those organizations that could eventually do that. And so I think many of us took a lot of risk with individuals, and I think in many cases it paid off. The other area of risk, I would say, is in a way very similar, but thinking of ways to really introduce new ideas and new models for doing things. And realizing that it's not about inviting people to a presentation where we talk about, say, a community foundation in the US or in the UK, and say, this is how it works, this is a great idea, wouldn't you like to do that? But actually saying, okay, that's the idea, here's a program for supporting you to learn more about it, to do study visits, and here's an extensive funder pool to invest in that idea over the long term. And maybe then in 15 or 20 years, as we see now in Eastern Europe, there will be community foundations. But at that initial moment, it was quite a risk to say, this is something we're gonna try to help promote and see established.
And
local philanthropy.
Local philanthropy.
I think that's absolutely essential. I mean, I think, you know, if you're in it for the long haul, I mean, you really have to start thinking about sustainability. And I think there are always, for me, two issues of sustainability. One is the sustainability of the partners that you support. As a grant-making foundation, we support, I don't know, 100 organizations across the region. Their sustainability is going to be very, very difficult to achieve because they're operating at budgets that are not to scale in the region because they've had support from Mott, from 15, 20 other funders. But I think the sustainability issue for civil society in general, for grassroots organizations, for new organizations that emerge, is what we should really be focused on. And for that, local philanthropy is absolutely essential because those organizations will begin to operate at the scale. Those new organizations that appear 5, 10, 15 years into the transition will begin to operate at a scale that is different than the ones that started in the first 5 or so years when there was masses of money available. And so they can much more, it's much more feasible for them to be able to rely on support from their community or from other funders. But I think local philanthropy isn't just going to happen, it needs to be nurtured, it needs an infrastructure, it needs strengthening in the same way that any other field is doing. And we're seeing some really positive signs now in parts of Eastern Europe, not just in Poland and the Czech Republic and other places, but also in Serbia and Bosnia. Certainly Turkey is a whole other issue. Yeah. So that's, and the other, one last thing about philanthropy, I think the other thing we have to realize about philanthropy, local philanthropy, is that all of us are very interested in civic engagement. I mean, that's a big theme, I think, no matter what you do in any transition, civic engagement is critical. And I think local philanthropy was much overlooked in the beginning in Central and Eastern Europe as a way for people to engage. I mean, most people in the end will not join nonprofits. You know, they will find their way of making their voice heard by giving to a cause that they believe in or volunteering their time to a cause that they believe in. And so it's a really essential part, beyond the financial aspect of it, to how people participate and engage in their new society.
Thank you all for coming, and thank you for our wonderful panelists. I'd like to all to